Hey mates, I never thought I'd be the one here, typing all this out for strangers. But here I am. I feel like my life just got flipped upside down, and I have no one to turn to right now. So here goes nothing. My name is Jack. I'm 43, been married to my wife Caroline for just over 12 years. We've got 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both under 10, and until recently, I thought we were a solid family unit. I've worked hard my whole life, built a small construction company from the ground up. We take on some wild projects, building homes in hard-to-reach places, up in the mountains and dense forests. It's challenging, but I love it. My crew is like family, too. They trust me, and I do everything I can to keep them safe. But I always kept Caroline and our kids at the center of it all. My job is tough, physically demanding, and a bit dangerous, but I thought coming home to them made it all worth it. Caroline was my world. She's beautiful, smart, and at least I thought loyal. I used to think she respected the life we'd built together, but now I'm not so sure. For the past few months, things have felt off, though. She's been cold, distant. She spends more time out of the house, usually vague about where she's going or what she's doing. Her phone is suddenly glued to her hand, and she shuts it off if I even glance at the screen. At first, I chalked it up to stress or maybe just needing space. We all go through things, right? But something felt wrong. I could sense it. Still, I thought maybe it was in my head. Caroline had been by my side for so long, through tough times and good. So, I tried to push the doubts away. Focused on work, on the kids, on making time for her when I could. But lately, every time I reach out, it's like she's just gone. A few weeks ago, I started noticing more things that didn't sit right. Caroline was acting secretive, always on edge. She'd started going out more, said she was meeting up with friends, which didn't make a lot of sense because, well, she's never been a big social butterfly. But I didn't push. I figured maybe she needed the break or was reconnecting with people. It's easy to lose track of friends when you're raising kids and handling everything life throws at you. Then she started coming home late, really late. She'd walk in with these excuses that barely held up, like she'd been out running errands all day, or she got held up in traffic, even though we live in a small town with barely any. I'd ask her casually who she was with, and every time, she'd give me a different name. Names of people I didn't know or people she hadn't mentioned before. When I'd press her, just lightly, she'd snap, saying I was being paranoid and smothering her. But the worst part? I could feel her happiness, like it wasn't for us. I'd watch her, and she'd be smiling, laughing to herself like she was carrying some secret joy, but it would vanish the second I entered the room. It was like I was the one disrupting her peace. I'm not the type to snoop or get suspicious, but something was nagging at me, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. So, one evening, I decided to pay her a surprise visit. I'd finished up on a job site early, and I thought I'd bring her some dinner from that Italian place she loves. It sounds cheesy, but I just wanted to surprise her, maybe rekindle a little of what felt lost between us. I knew she'd said she was meeting a friend for coffee that afternoon, so I figured I'd just swing by and join them. As I was pulling up to the cafe, I spotted her car, but she wasn't inside. I figured she'd just walked over to a nearby shop or something, so I waited in my truck watching the door. A few minutes later, I see her coming out, but not alone. She was with another man, a tall guy, dark hair, dressed sharp, definitely not from around here. They were laughing, her arm casually brushing his as they walked. At first, I thought, okay, maybe this is just a friend she mentioned. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But then they stopped, right there on the sidewalk, and she leaned in to kiss him. Right there, in broad daylight. That's when it hit me like a gut punch. I just sat there, watching my wife kiss another man like I was some stranger, not her husband of 12 years. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick, but I managed to hold it together long enough to snap a picture with my phone. I didn't confront her right then. I couldn't. I didn't even know what I would say. Instead, I drove off, numb 1,000 thoughts running through my mind. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same after that. That night, I couldn't keep it in any longer. I'd been carrying around this sick, heavy feeling, and I knew I had to say something. When she got home, I was sitting in the kitchen just waiting. I think she knew something was off right away because she got defensive the second she walked through the door. "Jack, why are you sitting there in the dark?" she asked, dropping her purse on the counter like it was just any other day. I didn't even know how to begin, so I just came right out with it. Who is he, Caroline? I asked, my voice barely holding steady. Her face changed, like a mask slipping, just for a second, before she quickly put on this look of confusion. What are you talking about? She asked, but I could see right through it. I pulled out my phone, showed her the picture of her with him outside the cafe. Her face turned pale. And you know what she did? She laughed. It wasn't a laugh of embarrassment or apology. It was this cold, dismissive chuckle like I was being ridiculous. Oh, Jack, you really went and did this? Followed me around like some jealous teenager. She shook her head, acting like I was the one who'd crossed the line. I told her I'd seen enough, that there was no way she could talk her way out of this. And instead of apologizing or even looking guilty, she rolled her eyes, like she couldn't believe I was making a big deal out of it. Fine, you know what? Believe whatever you want, she said. If you want to throw away our marriage over a little misunderstanding, then go ahead. A misunderstanding? I asked, barely able to keep my voice down. I saw you kiss him, Caroline. How is that a misunderstanding? She didn't even try to explain. Instead, she just shrugged and walked off, saying she was too tired to deal with my insecurity. It was like she had zero remorse, zero shame, and I was left sitting there shattered. I couldn't believe the woman I'd loved for over a decade could be this. Heartless. I didn't know what to do next. After that night, things spiraled fast. Caroline started coming home later, barely talking to me or the kids. When she did talk, it was all sharp words and rolled eyes, acting like any question I asked was an insult to her freedom. It was like she was punishing me for catching her, for daring to confront her. She spent more time out of the house, claiming she was meeting friends or working late, even though she didn't have a job that required late hours. Meanwhile, I was doing everything I could to keep things together, taking care of the kids, keeping up with my work, trying to play it cool. But inside, I was a mess, losing sleep, barely eating. I felt like my whole life was slipping through my hands. And her phone? She guarded it like it held the nation's secrets. She'd take it everywhere, even the bathroom, and kept it on silent. If I even glanced at it, she'd snap, telling me I was suffocating her, that I was the one ruining this marriage with my paranoia. She twisted it all around, made it seem like I was some controlling husband who couldn't give her space. But I knew what I saw. I knew what she was hiding. One night, out of sheer desperation, I decided to check her phone when she was asleep. I waited until she was out cold and, with my heart pounding, grabbed it from her side of the bed. But it was locked with a new passcode, one she'd never used before. That was it. I put the phone back and lay there, feeling like I'd lost her completely. I didn't know who to talk to about it. I mean, how do you even start to explain this kind of betrayal? I thought about calling up a couple of mutual friends, people who'd known us for years, but I didn't want to make it public. I wanted to believe there was still a chance, some way to fix this. But then I started getting strange looks from friends, awkward silences when I'd ask how they were doing. Something was up. Finally, I decided to reach out to my old buddy, Mike. We'd been friends since high school, and he'd always been there for me, no matter what. I gave him a call, and he came over that evening. We sat out on the back deck, beers in hand, the weight of everything heavy between us. It took me a while, but I eventually told him everything. What I'd seen, how she was acting, everything. He got quiet, looking uncomfortable, and after a long pause, he said, "Jack, there's something you should know." I felt a chill run down my spine. Mike told me that he'd seen Caroline around town a few times with another man, and that people were starting to talk. Apparently, it wasn't just casual meetings or running errands. They were seen at restaurants, out by the lake, even a weekend up at a cabin not too far from here. Hearing it from Mike, from someone who had no reason to lie, hit me harder than I'd expected. It wasn't just my imagination. My wife was having an affair, plain and simple, and other people knew. My head was spinning, the embarrassment, the anger. I couldn't stand the thought of being the last one to know, of being some fool everyone was quietly pitying. After my conversation with Mike, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep living in denial. I couldn't keep pretending that Caroline would somehow come back to me, that she'd suddenly realize what she was doing to our family. The betrayal felt too big, too consuming, like it had carved a hole in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided I'd confront her one last time. This time, I'd lay it all out, the things I'd seen, what I'd heard, everything. I wanted her to know that I wasn't some oblivious husband she could fool anymore, that I knew exactly what was going on. That evening, I waited for her to come home, pacing the kitchen, running through everything I wanted to say. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for months. When she finally walked in, she looked startled to see me waiting there, arms crossed. I didn't waste any time. "Caroline," I said, my voice steady but low, "I know you've been lying to me. I know about him, the weekends, the dinners, everything." She stared at me for a second, her face unreadable, before she let out a sigh and rolled her eyes. "So this is what you're wasting your energy on, huh?" she said with this mocking little smirk. "I've been miserable for years, Jack. But you don't see that, do you?" That was it. That was her excuse. Not an apology, not even an admission of guilt, just this deflection, like it was my fault she'd chosen to betray me. I felt my fist clench, but I kept my cool. "You could have told me," I said quietly, holding back the anger. "You could have been honest. But you chose to lie. You chose to sneak around and act like I didn't matter." She shrugged, as if it was all so trivial. "Maybe I did lie," she said, her voice dripping with indifference. "But you're no saint, Jack. You're gone all the time, always off working while I'm stuck here. Do you know how lonely that gets?" Hearing her blame me for her choices was like a slap to the face. I had nothing left to say. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, completely unfazed. It was like the woman I'd loved for so long had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. After that night, things went from bad to worse. Caroline seemed to take my silence as a green light to do whatever she wanted. She stopped hiding her outings, staying out until morning sometimes, leaving me to handle the kids, the house, everything. It was like she was daring me to do something about it, testing just how much I could take. Then, out of the blue, she started showing an unusual interest in my work. She'd ask about the projects, about the risks involved, which was strange since she'd never cared about my job before. She'd make little comments about how dangerous my line of work was, asking if I had enough life insurance, if my will was in order, things like that. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off. I figured she was just making conversation, maybe even feeling guilty about everything and trying to show she cared. But then, a few days later, one of my crew members, Tom, came to me, looking nervous. He told me that Caroline had shown up at a work site while I was out, asking about safety protocols, asking questions that went way beyond a casual interest. She'd even hinted that she was worried about accidents, that she hoped I was being extra careful on the job. Tom said it gave him the creeps, like she was fishing for something. I didn't want to believe it, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. And then it hit me. She'd started showing up at the exact project site where we were working with high-risk equipment, where one slip could mean a serious accident. It was almost as if she'd chosen this spot on purpose, like she was counting on something to go wrong. The thought was chilling. Caroline had always been stubborn, even manipulative, but this was a level of coldness I hadn't thought possible. I didn't want to believe she could be capable of something so sinister, but I couldn't ignore the signs. I realized that I had to be extra cautious. After that unsettling realization, I started paying close attention to everything happening on site. I double-checked every safety protocol, inspected every piece of equipment personally, and told my crew to stay on their toes. I didn't let on why, but I think a few of them sensed something was up, especially since Caroline's concerned wife routine hadn't gone unnoticed. One morning, I was at the project site alone, getting things set up early. I was about to start one of the larger machines when I noticed something off. A metal support beam that should have been secured was dangerously loose. If I hadn't checked, it could have come down on me the second I started the equipment. My blood ran cold. It was positioned so perfectly, like someone had deliberately left it that way. I couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline might have had something to do with it. Maybe I was paranoid, but I couldn't think of anyone else with a reason to sabotage my work site. It's not like anyone on my crew had a problem with me. And given Caroline's recent behavior, her questions about accidents and insurance, it all clicked together in a way I didn't want to believe. I reported the incident as an equipment malfunction, not wanting to cause a scene without proof, but I knew I had to be careful. I started documenting everything, even small things, her strange questions, the surprise visit she'd made to the worksite, and now this loose beam. Part of me hated myself for even thinking she'd be capable of it, but something in my gut told me I couldn't ignore it. I had to protect myself, not just physically but legally too. The realization hit hard. This wasn't just about an affair or a broken marriage. This was about survival. After that near miss on the work site, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. If Caroline was behind this, if she was willing to go that far, then I needed solid proof. I couldn't risk a he said, she said situation. I needed undeniable evidence that something more than infidelity was going on. So, I did what felt like the only logical thing. I hired a private investigator. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd have to hire someone to investigate his own wife. But I was running out of options. I couldn't confront her again. Every time I tried, she'd twist things, somehow making me out to be the villain. And if I went to the police without evidence, I'd risk looking paranoid or delusional. I needed someone who could be an objective eye, someone who could dig into things I couldn't reach on my own. The investigator, Joe, was an older guy, ex-cop, no nonsense. I gave him everything I had, the suspicions, the questions, the strange incident on the site. He listened, nodding, and promised to look into it. He advised me to keep playing it cool, to keep things as normal as possible at home, so she wouldn't suspect a thing. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day, I went about my routine, pretending like nothing was wrong. I'd watch Caroline come and go, smiling to herself as if she'd won some silent victory. But I kept my distance, biding my time, waiting for Joe to come back with something concrete. And the more I watched her, the more convinced I became that whatever she was planning, it wasn't over yet. Part 11. The revelation after what felt like an eternity. Joe finally called me back. He sounded tense, like he'd found something he didn't want to tell me over the phone. We met up in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, where he slid a folder across the table toward me, his face a mix of pity and grim professionalism. "Jack, you're not going to like this," he said, voice low. I opened the folder, my hand shaking, and there was pictures, records, receipts, everything. Caroline had been meeting with the guy I'd seen her with before, the one she'd kissed outside the cafe. But this wasn't just some fling. According to Joe, the guy was connected to a shady group that specialized in accidents, setups for people looking to get out of marriages with a big payout. He showed me evidence of phone calls, cryptic messages between her and this guy, and even a draft of a life insurance policy she'd tried to increase behind my back. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I sat there, numb, staring at the evidence. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd actively plotted to remove me from the picture. To her, I was worth more dead than alive. I wanted to scream, to cry, but all I could do was sit there, feeling the full weight of what I discovered. Joe put a hand on my shoulder, telling me he could help me take this to the authorities. But we'd need more, something solid to show intent if we wanted to make a case. I knew I had to go back, to keep living alongside this woman who was planning my end, at least until we had enough to expose her for who she really was. Returning home that night was like stepping into a nightmare. Every look, every word from Caroline felt laced with something dark, something poisonous. She'd smile at me, but now I could see through it. There was no warmth, no real connection behind her eyes, just cold calculation. Knowing what she was capable of made every second in her presence feel dangerous. But I played my part. I acted normal, did the chores, helped with the kids, even forced myself to sit with her at dinner and make small talk. Inside, though, I was bracing myself, trying not to let my rage or fear slip. I knew if she caught on that I was aware, she might change her plans, or worse, rush them. I couldn't risk it, not with our children under the same roof. I started setting up precautions. I made sure friends and family knew about the worksite accident and left clues around for anyone who might look into things if something ever happened to me. I documented everything, including my suspicions and findings from Joe, and I kept these records in a secure place outside the house. I even told my closest friend, Mike, a little about what was going on, just in case. Every night felt like a ticking clock, wondering if she'd make a move or if I'd catch her in the act. I could see her frustration growing as her attempts to manipulate me weren't working. She'd make comments about how distant I was, trying to bait me into some argument. But I stayed calm, played the role, waited. And then one night she dropped a hint. She mentioned offhand that she thought I looked worn out, suggesting I take a break. Maybe go out to the cabin alone for a few days to clear my head. It was the same cabin Joe had linked to her lover, the place they'd met for weekends. That's when I knew this was the trap she was setting, and she wanted me to walk right into it. After Caroline mentioned the cabin, I knew I was walking on thin ice. She wanted me out there alone, isolated, in a place where an accident could easily be staged. I could almost see her calculating the payout in her head. But instead of confronting her or refusing outright, I acted intrigued. Maybe you're right, I told her, feigning exhaustion. I think I could use some time to unwind. She seemed pleased, maybe even a little too eager. You should, Jack, she said, her smile a little too wide. It'll be good for you. And for us. The way she said for us made my skin crawl, but I kept my composure, nodding as if her words had convinced me. The next day, I started making preparations as if I was actually going to the cabin. I packed a bag, left it where she could see it, even asked her if there was anything she wanted me to bring back for her. Her responses were unervingly cheerful, almost like she was saying goodbye. But I had no intention of going to that cabin alone. I called Joe and filled him in, and together we came up with a plan. I'd head to the cabin as if everything was normal, but he and a couple of his associates would be nearby, waiting to document anything suspicious. If Caroline or her friend showed up, we'd catch them in the act. So, that Friday, I kissed Caroline goodbye, told her I'd see her in a few days, and headed out, praying that this plan wouldn't backfire. Driving out to that cabin felt like I was heading straight into a lion's den, but knowing Joe and his team were stationed nearby gave me some reassurance. I kept my phone close, constantly checking for any updates from Joe, but tried to act as natural as possible. When I arrived, I settled in, turning on a few lights, making it look like I was staying there alone, completely unaware. I spent the first few hours pacing, checking the clock, and waiting. Every sound outside made me jump. Every crack of a twig in the woods had me on edge. Then, late that night, Joe sent me a message. She's here. My heart pounded as I read those words. Caroline had actually followed through. She was nearby, along with her lover, and they were likely making final plans to get rid of me. Joe updated me regularly, whispering through the phone to tell me they were moving closer, positioning themselves to make their move. He said they parked down the road and walked in, probably hoping to catch me off guard in the dark. I killed the lights, hoping to give them the illusion that I'd gone to bed, hoping they'd come closer. The tension was unbearable, knowing they were just outside, waiting to strike. I clutched my phone like a lifeline, waiting for Joe to give me the signal. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the cabin, cautious and calculated, moving toward the door. My heart was hammering, but I stayed still, trusting Joe and his team were ready. It was time to expose the monster Caroline had become. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside the cabin door. My pulse was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Joe had told me to keep calm, but sitting there in the dark, waiting, was like holding my breath underwater. Then came the faint click of the door handle turning. They were testing it, seeing if it was locked. I hadn't secured it fully, just enough to make it seem closed, but easy enough to open, to draw them in without suspicion. I heard a whisper, too low to make out, but I knew it was Caroline and her lover. I could feel their presence just feet away, separated by only a thin wall and a wooden door. Then, a bright beam of light flooded the room. Joe's team had turned on floodlights outside, catching them in the act. I heard Caroline gasp, followed by hurried footsteps as she and her accomplice tried to run. But it was too late. Joe and his associates were already on them, calling out their names, cameras flashing to capture every reaction, every desperate attempt to flee. I stepped outside, and for the first time looked Caroline directly in the eyes. She froze, her face twisted in shock and horror. Gone was the smugness, the cold indifference. She looked terrified, knowing that her plan had crumbled, that she'd been caught red-handed. "What were you thinking, Caroline?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her lover was already trying to pull away, muttering about how this was a mistake, how he had nothing to do with it, but Joe's team wasn't letting either of them out of their sight. In that moment, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted off my shoulders. The truth was out, undeniable, and I wasn't the fool she'd made me out to be. She'd crossed the line, and now she was going to face the consequences. Joe's team had done their job well. Within minutes, local law enforcement arrived, lights flashing, as officers stepped out and approached the scene. Caroline and her lover looked around, panicked, as reality set in. They were trapped, their plan fully exposed, with nowhere to run. The officers took statements, examining the evidence Joe had meticulously collected. Joe presented them with the recorded conversations, the pictures, and records that showed her intent to have me out of the picture permanently. It was undeniable, and the weight of it seemed to crash down on Caroline. As they led her away in handcuffs, she finally broke. She looked at me, her face contorted with anger and fear, hurling insults, screaming that I'd set her up, that it was all some big misunderstanding. But her words felt empty. There was no manipulation, no excuse that could twist her way out of this. Her lover tried to distance himself too, claiming he'd been dragged into it, but the officers weren't buying it. Watching her, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. This was the woman I'd once loved, the mother of my children, and now she was someone I barely recognized. It was like she'd peeled back every layer and revealed a person I'd never known, someone capable of plotting to end my life for money and freedom. As she disappeared into the police car, all I could think was how close I'd come to falling for it, to becoming just another accident. The officers wrapped up, promising to be in touch with further instructions. Joe put a hand on my shoulder, nodding with a look that said he understood everything I couldn't put into words. He'd saved my life, and there were no words for the gratitude I felt. I drove home in silence, the dark road stretching out ahead, feeling like I was leaving an old life behind and stepping into something unknown. The days following her arrest were a blur. Friends, family, and even acquaintances reached out, all shocked by the news. I told only a few close people the real story, keeping most of it private, but word spread quickly in our small town. Everyone wanted to know how Caroline could do something so unthinkable. I was bombarded with sympathy, disbelief, and questions, but I felt numb, barely able to respond. My main focus was on the kids. They were too young to understand the full story, so I kept it simple, explaining that their mom had gone away for a while. The reality of single parenthood hit me hard, and there were moments I found myself on the edge, wondering how to keep it all together. The structure and routine of my work helped, but the emotional weight lingered. One evening, after I'd put the kids to bed, I sat on the couch alone, looking around the quiet house that felt emptier than ever. Memories flooded in, of Caroline and I laughing over dinner, of family trips, of a life that felt perfect on the surface. But now, all those memories felt tainted. I wondered how much of it had been real, how much had been a facade, a cover for her hidden contempt. The hardest part was letting go of the life I thought I had. The betrayal, the manipulation, it had cut deep, and I wasn't sure how to heal. But I knew one thing for certain: I'd survived. And for the sake of my kids, I was determined to rebuild, even if it meant starting from scratch. As the weeks passed, the legal process began to unfold. The district attorney reached out, confirming that Caroline would be facing multiple charges, including attempted conspiracy to commit murder. I had to prepare myself for the fact that I'd have to see her again, in court this time, where she'd try to defend the indefensible. When the trial finally began, I walked into the courtroom, feeling the stares and whispers from people I knew in the community. Sitting at the witness stand, I had to recount everything, from the small suspicions to the final confrontation at the cabin. It felt surreal, almost as if I were watching someone else's life unravel. Caroline sat across from me, her gaze cold, sometimes seething, sometimes vacant. Her lawyer argued that she'd never intended to harm me, that everything had been misinterpreted, that I was exaggerating out of spite. They painted her as a frustrated wife who felt trapped in a loveless marriage, spinning a story that made her look like the victim. Hearing this version of our life made me feel sick, But I kept my head up, determined to let the truth speak for itself. Joe testified too, presenting all the evidence he'd gathered, the photographs, the texts, the documents Caroline had tried to cover up. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer, shattering the weak defense her lawyer tried to build. Her lover, on the other hand, turned on her, claiming he'd been manipulated, that he was just an unwitting pawn in her game. It was pathetic, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. At the end of the trial, the jury took only a few hours to deliberate. When they returned with a guilty verdict, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering ache of betrayal. I'd won, technically, but there was no real victory here. The woman I'd once loved was lost to me, and all that remained was the painful task of moving on. With the trial behind me, I thought I'd feel a sense of closure. But instead, I was left with a strange emptiness, like a door had closed, but the room was still dark. Caroline was sentenced to prison, and just like that, she was removed from my life. Yet the scars she left were far from healed. The hardest part was explaining things to the kids. They were old enough to know something serious had happened, but too young to understand the depths of it. I told them the truth, as gently as I could, that their mom had made some bad choices, ones that meant she couldn't be part of our lives right now. They asked questions, some that I didn't have answers to, and others that broke my heart. I reassured them that they were loved, that none of it was their fault, and that I would always be there for them. Friends and family rallied around us, offering help, babysitting, even financial support. They became my lifeline. My crew from work also stepped up, doing everything they could to lighten my load. I leaned on them in ways I never had before, grateful for their loyalty, their willingness to be there without judgment or expectation. There were nights when the weight of everything felt unbearable, when I'd sit alone, haunted by memories and questions I couldn't shake. How had I missed the signs? Could I have done something differently? But with time, I began to accept that there were no easy answers, that Caroline's actions were hers alone, a betrayal I couldn't have foreseen or prevented. Slowly, I found myself inching towards something like healing. I started taking the kids on weekend trips, getting us all out into the mountains and woods I loved so much, places where the fresh air and open skies seemed to cleanse the lingering shadows. Each trip, each day spent laughing with my kids, felt like a small step back toward the life I wanted to build for us. I knew I couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, I could learn to live with it and build a future that was stronger and truer than the life I'd left behind. Months passed, and bit by bit, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. The kids and I developed our own routines, finding comfort in the simple things: family dinners, bedtime stories, weekend hikes. These small rituals became anchors, grounding us in the present and helping us look forward instead of back. In time, I found myself putting more heart into my work again, building homes in secluded places filled with peace and beauty, had always been a way for me to share that sense of refuge with others. But now, each project felt like more than just a job. It became a testament to resilience, to the idea that a strong foundation could withstand even the most brutal storms. Every beam I raised, every nail I hammered, felt like a promise to myself and my kids that we could rebuild, that we could create something meaningful, even after all we'd been through. And I wasn't alone. My crew, my family, my friends, they stood by me, helping me find my footing again. The support they gave me showed me what true loyalty looked like, and I'd never take that for granted. I knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet strength, a new sense of purpose. If there was one thing I'd learned from this ordeal, it was this: sometimes, the people you trust most can betray you in ways you'd never imagine. But even when that trust is shattered, even when everything you've known crumbles, there's still hope. You can pick up the pieces. You can build again. And in the end, you discover that the real wealth, the strength, the love, the values that define you was within you all along. Now, when I look at my kids, I know that they're my legacy, my true foundation. And I'm resolved to be the kind of father, the kind of man they can look up to. I may have lost one life, but I've been given another, and I'm determined to make it one worth living.